Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour program is World Watchers. It is program number 808, and it is June the 1st, 1987. This is the 20th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I don't know how many of you were involved in enjoying the music 20 years ago. Ted Koppel had two guests on his Nightline last Friday night, one Bob Green from Newsday, who also writes books, and a symphony conductor who was influenced by the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper's, the music of the Beatles and this particular album 20 years ago. Bob Green told about being in a fraternity, and there was one phonograph, and then he and his roommate each had their own Sgt. Pepper. It was important that each one collected his own, and he said down the fraternity row you would hear different cuts of the music, and everybody in each house, of course, had their albums, one or more per house, and particularly per each individual. I laughed about that because as my children grew up and went to a school out of town, and some moved to L.A., and they moved around the country, they left a lot of their record collection at the home, in my home here. Some they have with them and some they left here. And I went to my Beatles section and pulled out 6 Beatle albums of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Each one of the family had it except my husband, who didn't understand it at all. And these albums are well worn out. If you look at them, they were handled over and over again. So I don't have to tell you exactly what it meant to me, but I might share just a few thoughts about it. George Harrison's song, I liked all the cuts, of course, but George Harrison's song was something new for me hearing in music, considering what we had through the 40s and 50s and the early music up to that time. Without You is the song where he's asking to examine the space between us, and he says that people who hide themselves behind a wall of illusion and never glimpse at the truth, then it's too late and they pass away. They have never seen it and they die. And he said the truth is about love, about sharing, to find out the best there is. With love, we could save the world if they only knew. Try to realize it is within you, he said. You remember those words, within yourself. No one can make you change. You have to make yourself change. And to see you're really only very small. You don't have to be big to change the world. And life flows on within you, either in you or without you. Whether you partake of this world or not, it goes on without you. He said we're talking about love that's gone so cold, and the people who gain the world and lose their soul. And you might think of that. Ronald Reagan was governor of California for 1 year at the time this was produced. And they didn't know Reagan at the time, but they had a view of the world, and George Harrison was, all of them were very bright. And the song goes on to say, they gain the world and lose their soul, they don't know, and they can't see. And are you one of them? He asks. And then the ending goes, all the time will come, and the time will come when we'll see we are all one, and that life flows on within you and without you. Whether if you want to be in you, it's there. If you don't partake, it goes on without you. And that was just one cut from the album, and of course in those days and from then on and before then, I was influenced by the early Beatles, and this is the album that seems to get so much attention. Well, in 1967, I just pulled out about 6 or 7 dates of important things that were happening the year of Sgt. Pepper. It wasn't all Sgt. Pepper that was going on. In April of 67, 2 months before that came out, General Westmoreland was protesting against the war resistors in the United States, and he was telling Lyndon Johnson that we must bomb industrial targets harder in Southeast Asia. 1967 was the year to halt the attempt to get Fidel Castro, call off the Cuban War. And I bring this up because I'm going to mention again the lawsuit of the Christic Institute, where the original team of the Iran-Contra gators who worked in the Bay of Pigs were diverted to other areas and left Castro as is, while they began to change the world and leave that particular island as a whipping boy. 1967 in June was the time the Israelis attacked the U.S. Liberty ship. 35 were killed, 75 were wounded, and nobody paid any attention to it at all. In 1976 is when the United States government began secretly sending bonds to Taiwan, Korea, Chile, and Israel. 1967 is the year Jack Ruby died. He asked Earl Warren to take him out of Texas. Gerald Ford was there as a member of the Warren Commission. He said, "Take me to Washington where I can talk. You have the power to take me, and if I'm eliminated, there won't be any way of knowing. I can't say it here. I may not live even tomorrow to give testimony." He was ready to have a hearing before the judge at Wichita Falls. He was dying in the jail, and they took him to Parkland Hospital when he died. 1967 was the year, 1 year before Robert Kennedy was assassinated in California, but the year that Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan set up the Garden Plot, known as Operation Splicer, with help of the Georgia National Guard, and this was the beginning of the SWAT teams to round up dissidents in case there were riots again. And in 1967 is when Daniel Ludwig, one of the richest men in the world, went to Brazil to begin a large tree forest, but took access to the northern part of Brazil, hundreds and hundreds of acres, thousands of acres of Brazil. And CIF Project Merrimack began in 1967. This was the CIA work with the FBI, and Merrimack were the plans against black leaders, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and black leaders. And 1967 is when John Mitchell and Richard Nixon began to combine their law offices and merge together. And then Mitchell went on to be Attorney General and then on to jail. Nixon became the president in 1968, 1 year later. David Ferry in New Orleans died in 1967, February 67, just a month after Jack Ruby died, and these two fellows were acquainted. Jim Garrison planned to arrest Ferry, and a couple of days later he was dead of a karate chop on the head, and the person with him also died in Florida shortly afterwards. 67 was the time that Thieu was in control of Vietnam, and the priests were burning themselves on the streets in Saigon. And in April of 67, just 2 months before the Sgt. Pepper album came out, there was a military coup in Athens put in by the CIA Litton Industry, and so a lot was happening. This was the first Nazi regime in Athens with swastikas and so forth since World War II. George Lincoln Rockwell was killed in 1967. Lee Harvey Oswald kept his name in his notebook. This is the American Nazi Party. It didn't end the Nazi Party in California. It turned it over to the Defense Department. And Che Guevara was killed in Bolivia, and I'll do more on that later this week or next week in great detail. The murder of Che Guevara that involved Mr. Gomez Rodriguez, who you saw on television testifying this week, and the Central Intelligence Agency with Klaus Barbie and the Bolivian police, all working together in 1967. Dr. Mary Sherman, a friend of David Ferry's, who attended the Bilderberger meeting in England, was killed in New Orleans. Clay Shaw was dead. He had no trial. Clay Shaw was arrested. He died later at the time, in about it was the time the House Select Committee was investigating the assassinations. Clay Shaw was arrested by Jim Garrison. And this was the time that he was pulled in. This was the first charge of conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination that went to court. And in 1967, the CIA Operation Phoenix was going full-blown in Vietnam, where 40,000 non-military people were killed, women, children, parents, grandparents in huts, and that involved the Iran Contra gators, General John Singlaub, General Richard Secord, CIA Theodore Shackley, CIA Thomas Kleins, CIA Chichi Quintero, CIA Gomez Rodriguez. They were all involved in Southeast Asia with William Colby and the Phoenix program. An Australian Prime Minister disappeared. He went swimming and drowned. An ex-OSS gentleman, Jim Thompson, disappeared. The Silk King from Thailand disappeared, and his sister was murdered 5 months later. And I bring this up because the idealism that George Harrison had was sounding good and giving hope to a generation who should both balance the events of the world and the enjoyment of the music or the message of the music, and not be lulled to thinking we are all one and therefore there is peace. There was this contradiction going on, and I was a part of both of them studying the political conspiracies, but very much enjoying the music. There'll be the 20th anniversary of Monterey Pop this summer, and we bought 7 tickets to every single performance so all the children could go and hear each of these artists. We participated in the music scene and in the scene a great deal, where I literally dropped out from what I was until I had moved up to Carmel about 1965. But a person cannot afford to enjoy one thing at the expense of other. You can enjoy the music, but you have to get more political. People have to get more political at the same time, because the political people don't stop because of the few words of music. Now, I mentioned the Persian Gulf incident being like the Gulf of Tonkin for Ronald Reagan. I just want to tell you about another diversionary, and interestingly enough, it was written in a book by William Sullivan of the FBI shortly before he died. He was the head of Division 5 of FBI, and he tells how he didn't believe that James Earl Ray acted alone in the murder of Martin Luther King, but in his book, The Bureau, he explains that the British had arrested James Earl Ray 2 days before the announcement was released. Sullivan said Ray was in custody in London for 2 days before J. Edgar Hoover released the story to the press. He waited until the day of Robert Kennedy's funeral to break the news so that the FBI could steal the headline from the Kennedys one last time. So the same people were behind the murder of Martin Luther King as Robert Kennedy. So the synchronicity was really great, letting James Earl Ray go to London and Portugal and back to London. And then in the interim of the 2 months while he's living high over in Europe, and has gone there with passports with the help of a lot of other people, Robert Kennedy is murdered. Kennedy participated in the Martin Luther King funeral. Then the day that Kennedy was buried, the headlines, according to William Sullivan, who was close to all of these scenes, were taken away by James Earl Ray being pronounced caught in London. They already had him and probably knew where he was every hour up to years before Martin Luther King was killed. J. Edgar Hoover was after Martin Luther King. That all is part of American history, but it's interesting in the synchronicity because I think of the diversion of the Persian Gulf at this time and the controversies about Stark, the USS Stark, because I believe it was an agent provocateur incident to take the attention off the Iran-Contra hearings and make the president commander-in-chief if he wants to declare war. The new issue of Freedom magazine has 2 articles, a continuing research article by L. Fletcher Prouty called Visions of a Kennedy Dynasty, and then they have a chapter or a section from Jim Garrison's new book titled Coup d'Etat. The section is called The Murdered Talents of the CIA, and this is very important to the lawsuit the Christic Institute has, to the Iran-Contra affair, because the people Jim Garrison is writing about are the people involved with the Iran-Contra Christic Institute suit. I'll do more on this article later. You can send for it, so you should subscribe to Freedom. They're doing a wonderful job. The address is 1301 North Catalina Street, and it's LA 90027. I suggest you help support these people with the wonderful work they're getting out, and as I say, I'll detail these articles later. Now, the affidavit of the Christic Institute is getting a lot of play on the FM radio stations and a lot of discussion, and people are calling me all the time. Listen to this station. Have you heard this? Have you heard KKUP, KPFA? And they're mentioning the times that the information is on the air. A tape was made by Daniel Sheehan, who filed the lawsuit against specific Iran-Contra gators, filed it 1 year before Mr. Hassenfuss landed. Well, it was filed about a half a year before he landed in Nicaragua, but it covers these people, and it was detailed long before these men became household words or became familiar to the American public. And Danny Sheehan said in the affidavit, these defendants, some have been tagged by press as contrapreneurs, represent the epitome of organized crime, but on an international scale. They deal wholesale in narcotics, drugs, illegal weapons, and violence. Rather than take over local businesses, they seek to take over whole nations. This is the affidavit, the beginning of it. They do not hesitate to murder, and destroy anyone or anything that gets in their way. By any definition, the defendants in this suit are alleged merchants of heroin and terrorism, are organized criminals on a scale larger than life. And all of that is true. Now, in going into the secret team's history of political assassinations, and this affidavit was filed, as I say, in May, it's a year now, May 1986, I want to add to this because so many people are getting attention to what the Christic Institute has done. And it is the most challenging and the most encouraging thing to be able to catch in a net these very, very important people of the secret team, such as Robert Owen and John Singlaub and Theodore Shackley and Albert Hakim and Thomas Kleins and Chichi Quintero and General Secord. But it's also important because this may be the only chance that America will ever have again to get this team identified properly. And if you're off course, if you take a place in the road that takes you to the wrong diversionary, if you take one little side road, it won't take you to where you're going. It is very important in this time and place to be exactly on target, because if you miss a little bit, you miss the whole thing. And the secret team is referred to in the newspapers over and over again. You see articles about the secret team, the secret team, the secret team, conspiracy. Now I want to go back, just to set the record straight, to just an article that was written about a lecture or a series of lectures I gave in New York City in 1975. It was written by Charles Pakert, called Mae Brussell's Conspiracy Farm. I was talking at the Elgin Theater. This was in December of 1985, and I was saying that the members of these secret teams should be put into a conspiracy farm, retire them, give them a pension, and get them out of public life. And that's very important, because people like John Singlaub were taken out of duty. He resigned because of conflicts with Jimmy Carter, but then he goes on to run a secret government. G. Gordon Liddy is running training camps for terrorists. And E. Howard Hunt and James McCord, the Watergate people, are out probably continuing what they did before. And we see Richard Nixon getting medals in Paris, an honorarium. The secret team was not put out of public life. They were allowed to continue what they were doing, and they're even more effective out of the public life, because then they can say, I'm a private citizen. If you notice, the Iran Contragators say, I'm a private citizen. Colonel Dutton leaves the Air Force, the military, May the 1st, and on the May the 2nd, he goes to TCI, Stanford Technology Training Group, and he's ready to work. Robert McFarland leaves the National Security Council, goes to his home. He's former National Security Director. Then the next day, they put in the NSC computers, the tapes, the secret banks, and he starts traveling around with members of the NSC. But he says former. And once they're former, I said they should be put in the conspiracy farm. Now, I'm not going to do the whole article that he did about me. Most of it I will. It was published in the Soho Weekly News, December 25th, 1975. If you send a self-addressed stamped envelope, a long envelope, legal size, I'll send you a copy of the article. But this is what he said, and I want you to think of it in terms of the Christic Institute suit. Forget the Iran-Contra hearings. I mean, they're complete washouts. We'll do more on that later. But think of the Christic suit, and then think of 12 years ago, what I was saying, and what we have to add, what Danny Sheehan and the others back there have to add to what they have to get on the right road and not be diverted and not lose these big fish by taking the wrong turn on the road. The article says, Mae Brussell's conspiracy theories, in her own words, are outrageous to many people. The 3 capacity audiences who flocked to the Elgin Theater last Thursday, December 18th, I did morning, noon, and night, came to see if Brussels' theories live up to her claim. They couldn't have walked away disappointed. Laden with stacks of newspaper clippings, evidence from the Warren Commission, copies of documents from the National Archives, the California researcher wove facts, testimony, figures, and personal conjectures in an attempt to expose the tentacles of conspiracies originating from the highest level of government. And what I meant then is not the mafia, not Giancana or Trafficana, but when Robert Mayhew of the CIA and FBI hires Trafficana, he comes from the highest levels of government, from the National Security Council. Conspiracies, in Brussels' view, have dictated the course of American political life for the past 12 years. He dated it 12 years, although I started my work when John Kennedy was killed, and that was in 1963. And at that, he's talking about the point that I caught on that there were the conspiracies 12 years ago. I hadn't done any research before that time. My research, Brussels told the Elgin audience, indicates the assassinations of John and Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, events such as Chappaquiddick, murders committed by the Manson family, Watergate, the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, all are trained to the same source. And that source, in the United States, Brussels maintains, emanates from two places here, the Pentagon and the National Security Council. And I think with the Iran-Contra affair is the first time the American people can see the Department of Defense and the NSC as being the kingpins. That General Wilson from Pellegrin was stating in the Philadelphia Press that I cited for you, 90% of our work is Defense Department, 10% is the CIA, so they're fall guys. And if you hear Ollie North's name in every bit of testimony, North did this, North did that, remember that behind North is Fritz Kramer. I didn't know his name then, but I knew the National Security Council. The article says Brussels believes that the nucleus behind the conspiracies is a continuation of the Third Reich. And that is the important point that has to be remembered about these heroin dealers, assassins. The Third Reich, coming right out of Germany and Reinhard Gehlen, and John J. McCloy and Alan Dulles and William Donovan and William Casey and Vernon Walters, is the Third Reich. It isn't drug dealers. It is control of the world for persons who want to make the world all white, all Aryan, and are presently eliminating all the population in Africa by way of diseases, droughts, and even testing the neutron bomb. I said their headquarters were, he had it wrong, Bermuda. They were Montego Bay in Jamaica, the headquarters of the British intelligence William Stevenson combined with the American OSS and CIA. She singled out the Howard Hughes financial empire as being the most powerful organization in the world today. Now, the Howard Hughes organization hired Robert Mayhew, who was FBI and CIA, but went under the Hughes organization because it was a private organization, just like TCI or Stanford Technology Training Group is a private organization, and they hired Mayhew. Now, the Christic suit begins with Robert Mayhew meeting with Santos Trafficanta, Meyer Lansky's associate, and setting up the team that were allegedly to kill Fidel Castro and be part of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which has not taken place and I believe did not intend to happen. As I say, it was the whipping boy to get Castro. But the important thing here is that 12 years ago I was singling out the NSC and the Pentagon. 12 years ago was the Hughes organization. 12 years ago was the Third Reich. And I'm going more into the Third Reich with John Singlaub and Jesse Helms for the next few weeks. She singled out the Howard Hughes financial empire as being the most powerful in the world and cited as proof of its alleged control of the all-inclusive data bank located outside Salt Lake City, guarded by the Mormon Mafia, and used substantial involvement in the construction of international communication system. She accused the Hughes organization of involvement in the conspiracy that murdered John Kennedy. Howard Hughes is no longer alive. He was buried 3 years ago off a Greek island, which he was, by Aristotle Onassis, and it was Onassis' yacht that housed Hall Marschak, the father-in-law of Otto Skorzeny, and all the top Nazis as soon as John J. McCloy and Alan Dulles, McCloy particularly, had them released from the prison in Germany. Yet the danger remains, she told her listeners, because the inner circle of the conspiracy is certainly non-monolithic. It is spread out in the United States, Europe, South Africa, Although diversified, everyone involved at high level of my research, everyone involved is a Nazi. And she warned, beware of the Nazification of America, and urged them to work against Ronald Reagan. Now, he was governor, but he wanted to be president, and he was governor in California from 66 to 74. He had just been out 1 year. Be careful of Reagan. He has been selected by the secret team to be the president, and he is the Fuhrer. And that point has been missed by too many people for too long. They have to go back to the early career of Reagan at Warner Brothers and with the House Un-American Activities and with Errol Flynn and the milieu of Hollywood where Reagan circled, and how his career was put to the point where he has us on the verge of World War III in the Persian Gulf. The John Kennedy assassination, this article goes on, quoting me from the lecture, remains a focal point of her conspiracy theory, in contrast to Warren Commission critics who are citing a mafia CIA Cuban links in the events in Dallas. Brussell goes back to the testimony of the Warren Commission, the hearings themselves, and of course I've never stuck with the background that the anti-Castro Cubans, the mafia, and renegade CIA were behind all of this. They are simply the leg people for a larger conspiracy, and this article goes on, and then it quotes the part that these people should be farmed out, let them grow fruits and vegetables and be productive, and called a conspiracy farm. People involved in these conspiracies should be let out and kept away from public life. And then he quoted a statement I made about the Warren Commission, which is identical to the Senate House Iran hearings now. Every conspiracy has a cover-up. She cited the Warren Commission report as a classic example because of the manipulation of witnesses, which is what we're seeing now, not asking the right questions, which we're seeing now, not using the testimony of the witnesses when it doesn't fit in with their conclusions. And these stories about the anti-Castro Cubans, the mafia, and the CIA connections to Dallas are a second-layer cover-up for the Third Reich, which was set up in Germany before the war was over. And there's a lot more to this article, but I did want to mention the points about Reagan, and then it goes into mind control and the use of mass murders to do a lot of the murders, and the Reinhard Gehlen operation, which I've written about for a long, long time, starting with my first published article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And it is very important to keep the eye on the Pentagon and the NSC and the Howard Hughes organization. The Hughes aircraft just sold and merged with General Motors, and several billions of dollars went to the Hughes Medical Institute, and they are now capable of funding all kinds of genetic experiments or diseases, and hardly accountable. They send money, millions and millions, out to hospitals, institutions, colleges, military, and there's nothing but cash flowing in for these various experiments. Now, getting to this secret team, giving the background of what I did and wrote about, and as I say, 12 years ago, that goes very fast, 12 years, I want to just mention a little bit about the testimony of John Singlaub and Mr. Gomez-Rodriguez, and Joseph Kurz, not Kurz particularly, but he's part of that team, because there is very high drama going on at those hearings. I hope you are taping them if you have television, if you're having radio, if you have radio, tape it off the air. These characters don't have swagger sticks, they don't wear black boots, they don't have armbands, they don't click their heels, but you're looking at the stone killers, the meanest killers, the Nazis. Not only are they drug dealers, but their affiliations are with Nazis, with the Gestapo, with the Fourth Reich. The Reich is very much alive, and to look at the table of the people questioning them, you think they were dining with kings and queens and giving them accolades and praising them to the heavens. Of course, John McClure of Idaho was on the board of World Anti-Communist League with John Singlaub and Jesse Helms and a team of others I'll do more about in a few minutes. But they just praise them as wonderful people. And the Democrats on the committee are little lambs who are almost embarrassed to ask a question that may give you one more view of that itty-bitty spectacle we're seeing that the media calls the secret team. The printed media is doing a wonderful job. I can hardly keep up with the newspapers, articles, file them, cross-file them, or read them. but that Iran-Contra hearing is the absolute worst. I've studied the Warren Commission, the Korea Gate, and the Senate Watergate Committee. I mean, I used to have a button. Well, I have a button, but I haven't put them out on the wall for a long time, a button collection. Where is Lee Harvey Oswald now that we need him? Now we need one. Where is Leon Jaworski now that we need him? I thought he was terrible. But this Senator Inouye and these people at this panel are the only word to say is disgusting, but consistent. They're part of the secret team, and they are going to cover up as much as they can. Therefore, as I say, the Christic Institute civil suit is maybe the only chance in the United States that we will ever get to get a glimpse of these people. And you can send checks to them. I'll give you their address and help support them, get information, and spread the word about the defendants they have, because they are indeed part of that secret team. I'll take a 1-minute break, give you the address of Christic after that, and continue with the secret team. This is Mae Brussell, and this is the second half of World Watchers, program number 808, and the address of the Christic Institute. It's in Washington, D.C., spelt like Christ, Christic, Institute, 1324 North Capitol Street, Washington, D.C., 20002. The phone number is 202-797-8106. Any donations are tax deductible. It will cost a small fortune to proceed to bring to trial these particular defendants, 27 of them in all. So any contributions for research work or long-distance calls or paper to get out their information would be appreciated, I'm sure. Now, there were two very important witnesses. I've followed these characters for a long, long time, and of course seeing them on the screen was very fascinating, and it's very frightening because they look as benign as a little piece of skin that's turned off color that turns out to be a skin cancer that isn't attended to, or a part of your body that has cancer, but it isn't seen or recognized. The San Francisco Examiner, May 28th, had a story, Arms Witness Tells Problems of Profiteering. And the arms witness, of course, is Felix Rodriguez, Mr. Gomez-Rodriguez. I use those two names because he has two aliases, Max Gomez and Mr. Felix Rodriguez, so I call him Gomez-Rodriguez to cover both of them. And he's telling about his fears that this incident of using Secord and Clines, General Secord and CIA Thomas Clines, could affect the president if anybody found out about it, because it would be worse than Watergate. Now, he thinks that profiteering from selling weapons is a scandal, but profiteering has gone on forever. In fact, people like General Dynamics are rewarded. They just got a huge contract for multi-million off the books money that's not accounted for. Profiteering isn't a scandal, it's a reward. But he said this could be worse than Watergate using these particular people. And when he went to Oliver North, shrugged it off, of course, and he went to Mr. Gregg, the assistant, the CIA operative, Donald Gregg, who was the primary aide to former CIA Director George Bush, and he went to see George Bush himself. Well, if that doesn't tell you that George Bush knew there were operations going on and shenanigans with Clines and Secord, nothing is said in the headlines about that, not very much. But it's there in the open if you want. And then, of course, this article goes on to say that this same Mr. Rodriguez is one of those who assisted in the murdering of Che Guevara, that he worked actively in Bolivia with the intelligence community, and one of his big points was killing Che Guevara, and no history on the Che Guevara connections to our intelligence community and Klaus Barbie, of course, are allowed to be brought up. And I'm going to spend maybe 2 broadcasts on that in the next few weeks to come. But it's just put out in the front like he was a hero. He helped kill Che Guevara. Not that it's a scandal or that we're working with these assassins. And his concern that this could be a Watergate did come out to be that way. And I'll do a lot more later on why I think this was an agent provocateur thing to, in fact, get George Bush out and Ronald Reagan out, or disfavor enough that Alexander Haig steps in the vacancy waiting behind the scenes for when George Bush falls. But in the book Klaus Barbie, it's called His Life and Career by John Beatty, there's a section about Klaus Barbie working for the United States, coming to Bolivia, sending arms to Israel in 1967. Another, the Sgt. Pepper year, 1967, Israel is being sent weapons by the notorious Klaus Barbie. And this book says the SS man was uncomfortable for a time because he was living down in Bolivia, and they were beginning to recognize the name of Altman and Barbie as being the same person. And this book tells how he worked with Hugo Banzer, a right-winger of German stock, who came into power in 1971 when there was a coup. And Banzer talked with Barbie and took him to the heads of the drug dealers, that they wanted to set up teams to destroy communism and the suppression of trade unions. And then it says, the book goes on, America's understandable fear about the spread of communism through South and Central America led to considerable activity on the continent by the CIA and the special forces of the Green Beret. The latter, a mobile force of crack jungle fighters, had been involved in suppressing Che Guevara's movement and enlisted the help of the Bolivian intelligence authorities. When Guevara was captured and killed in 1967, other revolutionaries and freedom fighters happened to take his place. A considerable portion of the intelligence about their activities was passed to the Americans by Klaus Barbie by way of the Bolivian secret police. And this book, of course, goes into the drug connections of Barbie. So in a few weeks, I want to do the role of George Bush, CIA Director, Air Cuba, and Mr. Cyrilis, whose name came up, who works with Mr. Gomez-Rodriguez, and George Bush's role with the Klaus Barbie Che Guevara network from Bolivia to the Republican Party, and do that in detail because those are the pieces left out of the big puzzle that make the orders go round and round. Now, another important witness on the stand this past week was Louis Tams, and of course John Singlaub was testifying the week before. But the San Francisco Chronicle has an article from Newsday, May the 30th, 1987, how the Contra Treaty came to light. And this is a very important article, and I will be doing many broadcasts referring back to this. In March 1986, a new treaty was signed in Central America on behalf of the United States, a pact that apparently not one official in the Reagan administration knew existed. It was a treaty with a Contra group led by Eden Pastora, known as Commando Zero. Now, in March 86, Pastora had already been shot in May of 1985. And in May of 86, the suit was filed by the Christic Institute about the shooting of Pastora and the Iran-Contra people that became prominent then. But Louis Tams, the U.S. ambassador to Costa Rica, was the first member of the administration to find out about the treaty. He discovered the agreement when he had retired Major John Singlaub over for dinner. Singlaub, a private, again, this is a major general, private citizen who should have been put on the conspiracy farm, was in Costa Rica as an envoy, but he wasn't representing the United States government. Tam said the former general was the envoy of conservative Jesse Helms of North Carolina. Around March 25, 1986, Singlaub went into the border into Nicaragua, met with Pastora. They signed what Tam said was a Pastora-Singlaub agreement. According to the pact, the United States, this is Jesse Helms in on this, the United States will provide boots, ammunition, encrypted communications, military equipment. In return, Pastora would move his men out of Costa Rica into Nicaragua with the help of unnamed advisors and train his men, then travel to Europe and South America to explain the true nature of Marxist-Leninism Sandinista governments all over Europe and South America. It was a nifty treaty. Tams, now a professor at Arizona State University, related all of it in his testimony this past Thursday. When I saw that, I said, you can't negotiate for the United States government. John Singlaub says that does not mean the United States government when he writes United States government. That means we private United Statesians. Tam sent a secret message to the CIA, to the State Department, the White House, to tell them about the treaty. We have reservations that Pastora will comply. However, Singlaub is the envoy of Jesse Helms. He will report to Jesse Helms his observations. The State Department hit the roof. Deputy Secretary of State John Whitehead and Elliott Abrams sent a blistering cable. What the Chronicle doesn't say, and it came out in the hearings, was that George Shultz also knew about this cable in the State Department. And they said, I fail to understand how you and the CIA representative could associate yourselves with an agreement that purports to commit the United States to provide military materiel. Tams explained that this was a group called the PPAs, the Patriotic Private Americans. That's Ollie North's term. He likes that one. The PPAs, they would aid private patriotic Americans sign a contract of the United States sending military equipment by way of Jesse Helms. Now, before I go on to Singlaub and Jesse Helms, I just want to mention that Nelson Hunt from Texas, Nelson Bunker Hunt from Texas, testified also last Friday, May the 30th, or May the 29th, on the special donations that he gave to the Contras, which were, in quotes, at least $500,000. Now, he emphasized that it was for private, non-military uses. He said, I'm for the Contras. There's a tax endowment, a national endowment for the preservation of liberty he gives money to. And Hunt's attorney, Mark Zimmerman of Dallas, said Hunt had been subpoenaed to appear before the federal panel. Now, Nelson Bunker Hunt is the gentleman written about in Jim Hogan's book Spooks that I mentioned over and over again, who wanted to use Robert Brown of Soldier of Fortune, who has the mercenary group, to head up in 1962 an ABG group, an American volunteer group that would kill 10,000 Americans, 10,000 American citizens who were political left or union people or fighting fascism. Fighting fascism was a crime. Remember the Freedom of Information papers that I sent for on Mae Brussell. I was sharing them with a couple of people last week, and they said I should put it on the air, and I haven't for a long time. And after I left New Orleans in 1967, the fall of 67, the summer of the Sergeant Pepper, the FBI began to set a file on Mae Brussell because she was afraid of fascism and even stated it publicly. So Nelson Bunker Hunt, whose history goes back to the Kennedy assassination, to General Walker, to Robert Morris, to the people that came from Munich, Germany for the assassination, Morris of the Knights of Malta, the University of Dallas. This whole team worked in Dallas, Texas, and Kennedy's murder was the first American coup put together by these people. And John Singlaub and Robert Brown are close together. Singlaub started Soldier of Fortune, and the book Spooks has the details. So Nelson Bunker Hunt gave a secret piece of testimony, and of course it wasn't heard by the public. Now, going back to World Watchers a few months ago, this was, I believe, in November, I was talking about the importance of John Singlaub and detailing the 8 most important sections of our society that would tag into the Iran-Contra affairs. And the hub of that whole wheel was John Singlaub. Now, John Singlaub is down there signing a United States agreement for military aid to a person who would then be paid to travel in Europe and South America and around the world talking about the Marxist-Leninists in Nicaragua. And I mentioned Singlaub as the hub of the wheel, that he is president of the World Anti-Communist League, filled with Nazi terrorists from World War II, that Singlaub is a part and chairman, or he head lead man, I would say, of the National American Security Council, which is the sister of the National Security Council. It's an off-government private group that influences and tells government what to do. I have to do more for you. I haven't done enough, hardly anything on the American Security Council. Singlaub works with the Knights of Malta, such as Prescott, Bush, and Alexander Haig, and William Simon, and Claire Luce. He taps into the Knights of Malta, the Vatican. He taps into the mercenaries, the Soldier of Fortune, similar to the Keeny Meanies from London, those private teams for military, British military. and he has up in Denver the headquarters with Robert Brown to recruit mercenaries that the NSC can use around the world. He's chairman of on the board of Western Goals with late Larry McDonald, Admiral Thomas Moore, Edward Teller, and of course Western Goals belongs to this Carl Spitz Chanell group in Washington as soon as Larry McDonald was killed. And Singlaub, of course, was the man pushing the neutron bomb when Jimmy Carter had a confrontation with him, and he stepped out to go into the private sector. So I was on to Singlaub for many, many years, many of them, but the important thing is that now this testimony comes out, right there, sworn testimony that he's speaking for the United States, sending military weapons, and he, in fact, is part of the United States secret team and one of the defendants in the Christic Institute. Now, in the next weeks to come, because the news flies so fast, I just want to list for you approximately 15 subjects that I have in envelopes ready to put on the air in manila folders just to get a gist of Singlaub and, of course, his interconnections with other people. And Singlaub works closely with what General Richard Secord calls the Enterprise. There's the TCI, the Enterprise. That's one part of this big triangle, and the other is this John Singlaub and his connections. The Enterprise, including Albert Hakim, a defendant in the Christic Institute, and, of course, Hakim, and I'll be doing more for you on this, received many, many millions of dollars from the Olin Foundation, and he left Iran and came to California and bought International Images, which became Stanford Technology. IIS was a subsidiary of TCI, and William Simon is the head of the Olin Foundation, and Simon is part of the AmeriCares group with a huge team funding the Contras, such as Prescott, Bush, and Claire Luce again, and it's a who's who of corporations funding the Contras. Now, I have sections on Jesse Helms, and the two main people here are Jesse Helms and Singlaub, who are making an arrangement down in Nicaragua for arming the military by way of Eden Pastora, hoping he didn't fall for it. But Jesse Helms, I'm going to do a section of Jesse Helms with his connections to Panama, to Arnulfo Arias. Arias was part of a Nazi alliance going back to the 1930s. He's 90 years old now, like John J. McCloy. In the 1930s, in Panama, he was accused of murdering 13 Jewish families. Jesse Helms in Chile with Auguste Pinochet, with Colonial Dignidad and death squads that government put in by ITT, Henry Kissinger, John McCone of the CIA. Jesse Helms in El Salvador with Roberto D'Aubuisson, working with Max Gomez-Rodriguez. And then you have John Singlaub on the board of Western Goals, along with the World Anti-Communist League inviting Mr. Roberto D'Aubuisson to Washington under the auspices of Carl Spitz Chanell and Oliver North. Then there's Jesse Helms in Taiwan with the World Anti-Communist League, and in South Korea with Reverend Moon and Ryoshi Sasakawa when they needed money for the freedom fighters, that private patriotic group, the PPG. They go to the great democracies, as I said before, of Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Taiwan, Brunei, the most repressive governments there are left. Well, that's a toss-up. But anyway, the PPG, the private patriotic group, America, the PPA, go to these countries of military dictatorships. Then there's a file on the World Anti-Communist League and Adolfo Calero, the Contras in Toronto with the known Nazis from World War II. And another large manila folder I have of John Singlaub of Western Goals with Nazi Mr. Stetsko and Theodore Oberlander and the World Anti-Communist League and the organization that wanted the 1,000-year Reich. Then there's Jesse Helms and John Singlaub with the Bay of Pigs persons involved in described in the book The Great Heron Coup that take in the Iran-Contra gators like Theodore Shackley, Thomas Clydes, General Secord, Chichi Quintera, and also include Michael Ledeen in the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. And there's Jesse Helms in Argentina with the junta and the death squads, and the contract of the Contras with the Argentine death squads working in Central America. And Jesse Helms in Mexico, they're very embarrassed in Mexico, the links of the PAN Party, which is a Nazi party linked to Spitz Chanell's offices in Washington, D.C., and the paperwork of Oliver North shows the words CAUSA on there. I'm going to do a link of Reverend Moon to Carl Spitz Chanell, John Singlaub, Western Gold, with members of the Luftwaffe, such as Eugene Wigner, and the Moon Organization, the front organizations. There's a very good article that just came out in Covert Action, spring of '87. It's issue number 27. Moon, it's titled Moon Law. God is Phasing Out Democracy. It's 10 pages of Reverend Moon, and of course Moon directly works with Oliver North, Carl Spitz Chanell, and the organizations in Washington that consist of the World Anti-Communist League, Western Gold, and all their other dummy front organizations. Reverend Moon's front organization names were supplied to me by a researcher in San Francisco, Paul Bernardino. You can send him a letter and get these 7 pages, send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and a couple of dollars donation. Write to 495 Ellis Street, number 1271, San Francisco 94102, Bernardino, just like it sounds, and ask for 7 pages of the Moon Organization. It would take 1 hour World Watchers to just cite those for you. And there's a diagram of CAUSA and the Moon Organization in the papers of Oliver North that involve Colonel Bohai Park. He's the political arm of the Unification Church, and of course they publish the Washington Times. I'll do the connections and accuracy of media to the World Youth League, to Oliver North, to the World Anti-Communist League, which is Jesse Helms and John Singlaub. Another article that I just cited last week, a series of pages, and each one of these topics I have a manila folder on to share with you, is on John Singlaub in Palau, the island where they're trying to change the rulings and not object to nuclear testing in the Pacific. And of course, John Singlaub is now with the World Anti-Communist League in the Philippines, trying to overthrow Corazon Aquino. There's a new book out, Waltzing with a Dictator, The Marcoses and the Making of American Foreign Policy, by Raymond Bonner. It just came out, published by Times Book. And John Singlaub is now working with the World Anti-Communist League and Jesse Helms in Laos. Article in San Francisco Chronicle, May 27th. And I'll do more about his work with the Laotians, the Heron tribes, the Mayo tribesmen, and bring them to the United States, and working with the intelligence community, sharing the Heron. But the backbone of these things, the organizations, is going back to the Third Reich, keeping it going, and the 1,000-year Reich. Another good article in People's Daily World this past week, Singlaub plots are global. And indeed they are, and they go into Robert Brown, Soldier of Fortune, and sending troops and working with Reverend Moon. And Singlaub is finally getting recognized by the media as being a global person. And then there are articles I have on World Anti-Communist League, John Singlaub and Jesse Helms Group, and the killing of Samora Machel in Mozambique in October of '86. And Reverend Moon and Singlaub and these same persons are now involved in France in the support of an outright Nazi, Jean-Marie Le Pen, PAN, who has a good chance of replacing Mitterrand and Chirac and becoming the head of France. So what you have in Palau and Laos and Philippines and in France and Argentina and all of Central America, all of these various countries, El Salvador and Chile is already Nazi, is the actually documented proof, and in Panama, of the Nazification of this world, with the places still untapped where they don't have total control. The Argentine junta was replaced after the Falkland War, but they could come in any time, an hour, and be back where they were, getting rid of a lot of people in order to have control of the world. And it is control of the world under the Fourth Reich, not the heroin. Not all the killing is for the Fourth Reich. It isn't for drug profit alone. It is for an idealism that has to be crushed and should have been crushed and never can until people recognize what it really is. Now I have a book that came out, and parts of it were reprinted in a magazine in France called Humanité, and it had the following figures in 1980, because you hear about the patriotic Americans, the freedom fighters over and over again. These hearings ad nauseum are about freedom fighters. Now, these statistics were 7 years ago, so you can add it up later in your mind. Over 30,000 people were killed in Chile up till 1980, when from the time Pinochet came in. After the 1973 coup, Over 40,000 people were killed in Guatemala after 1962. 100,000 people were killed in Haiti, very much supported by our government. 50,000 people have been killed in Paraguay in the same time period. 20,000 were missing in Argentina in 1977 alone. In 1 year, 20,000. And then the figure went up to 50,000. 50,000 people have been killed in El Salvador over the past 2 years. That's 1979 and 1978 up to 1980. 50,000. In Latin America as a whole, over 1 million people have been killed in 20 years. From 1960 to 1980, 1 million people were killed. Now, 1959 is the date of the secret team, according to the research, and stated by the Christic Institute, where Robert Mayhew teams up with these particular people who are not going to kill Castro. They're going to set up death squads all over the world. Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins were instrumental in Chile, and they were part of the Phoenix program in Southeast Asia and so forth. But 1 million people in 20 years, and John Kennedy, who was on their hit list, would be killed in 1963, Robert Kennedy in 1968, and then they were home free with Nixon and Reagan to do what they want. Now, speaking of do what they want, I have a lot more on these people, but I want to share with you an article from the LA Herald this past week, May the 24th, titled Harvard's Disgrace. A more truthful speaker for commencement day could have been chosen. And this is by Francis L. Lowenstein. He's a professor of history at Rice University, a member of the Historical Division of the State Department in the Eisenhower administration. He has published a book, Peace or Appeasement, Hitler, Chamberlain, and the Munich Crisis, published by Houghton Mifflin. And this is what Mr. Lowenstein says, that the commencement services at Harvard this next week, I suppose is in June, Harvard has invited Richard von Weizsäcker, Weizsäcker. I've done many broadcasts on him, President of the Federal Republic of Germany since 1984, to be honored at the commencement of June 1987 at Harvard University. The Harvard announcement said President von Weizsäcker was born to one of Germany's most distinguished families. This is what the brochure says, the announcement going out. The guest at Harvard is von Weizsäcker. And this is what this particular person, Francis Lowenheim, writes about him. Weizsäcker is the son of Baron Ernest von Weizsäcker, Adolf Hitler's top diplomat. The Baron served Hitler from 1938 to 43, and then he served Hitler as the liaison of Adolf Hitler to the Vatican from 43 to 45, and even had a say on when the Battle of the Bulge would begin, and that's when the top Nazis were rounded up, and it was prearranged to work for the United States, including Fritz Kramer, who sits on the National Security Council today. The article goes on, he was a convicted war criminal. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He only served 1 year when John J. McCloy got him out. McCloy, on the board of Chase Manhattan, who worked with Earl Warren in putting the Japanese in concentration camps in the United States. And he released the top Nazis, Hallmarschak, the chief banker for Hitler, Otto Ambros, the chemist for I.G. Farben. Otto Skorzeny was released not by McCloy. He left separately thanks to Senator Joe McCarthy, as did Fritz Kramer. His son vigorously tried to whitewash the past, and this author says the son is a liar whitewashing the past. Ernest von Weizsäcker entered German diplomatic corps in 1920. In 1933, he had the rank of minister to Switzerland. In 1936, Hitler brought him back to Berlin and named him head of the political section. Another great leap occurred when Joachim von Ribbentrop of the Third Reich wanted him to become Hitler's. When he became Hitler's second foreign minister, von Weizsäcker was promoted to the top position of state secretary for Hitler from March 1938 and kept that job until 1940. He came in 1935 and worked there till 1940. That March, he was invited to join the Nazi Party, member number 4,813,617, at the direction of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Waffen-SS, the murderous Schutzstaat, I can't pronounce it, Staffing. Weizsäcker was commissioned as an officer in the SS, that's the Gestapo. So was Fritz Kramer, an officer in the SS, and so was Otto von Bolschwing, who set up and was president of TCI that became International Imaging, all of them from the Waffen-SS. May 16, 1938, Hitler appointed Weizsäcker as a member of his personal staff of the SS. On January 30, 1942, the 9th anniversary of Hitler coming to power, Himmler promoted Weizsäcker to the rank of Brigadier General of the SS, a Brigadierführer. He held that position until the end of the war. 3 years of honors for Hitler's of honors for diplomatic group were important times, this author says. That was the Nazi takeover of Austria, of Czechoslovakia, and it goes into the role that his father took in these particular operations. And he had this article from the LA paper has a long list of letters he wrote on his opinions on these invasions that were consistent with Hitler's ideas all along the way. Now, is the father, what his father did, is the father responsible for the son later? The article goes on to say, after the long career of the father through the Russian invasion and supporting Hitler and Germany taking over occupied Germany and millions of Jews trapped, the father took the stand at Nuremberg, and his son then was a lawyer, the current president of Germany, who's going to be honored at Harvard. And the father said, I did nothing wrong. I didn't take part in anything. I offered resistance. My time is out, and I don't have time to go into what Richard von Weizsäcker did with his father. It's a long, long article, and I'll do more next week because he's going to be the guest speaker at Harvard, getting the honorarium this year at graduation at Harvard University, the home base of Professor Elliott and Henry Kissinger in the Harvard studies. And it is important to understand where these people kept their lineage with the OSS CIA that formed the organizations out of which Secord, Hakim, Shackley, and all of them are working in 1987. They all tie together. But there isn't time to finish this one article. I'll begin with it next week and continue on the Nazification of America using the Iran-Contra gators as what we call the secret team. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you more to start with Richard von Weizsäcker at Harvard University.